Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise. Stuart, thank you so much for joining us. I know you may have recorded the Reith lectures a bit ago, but it's, I imagine, been quite a busy week. So thank you very much indeed for making the time. I'm hoping that I can see Helen Margetts too. Let me see, I'm going to try and find her as well. But if she's just coming, she's not here yet. But Stuart, you're here. Stuart, can I tell you what I'd like to do? I'm going to try a new format for a Radio 4 program, which is the cousin of Just a Minute. And the idea is it's called Hang On a Minute. And the idea is if you're imagine yourself, you're in the Alan Turing Institute, you're in the sort of 11th row at the back. And as Professor Stuart Russell is giving the Reith lectures on AI in our lifetime, you're allowed to press a buzzer and go, hang on a minute, can you explain this, that, and the other? So I would love to do that in the course of this conversation. There's so much in what you said, but I really wanted to zero in, if we could, on the tease at the end of your first lecture, which is a provably beneficial kind of AI and the sort of positive prospectus for AI, because I know we're going to hear about AI and warfare and other things, but what we never hear, what you rarely hear, is an organized argument for how AI works in ways that improve our society. And there's a phrase you use early on in the first lecture, which is about something around the idea that greater intelligence will lead to a greater civilization. And I just thought to myself, I'm not sure that's true. So can you explain how it's true?
Well, so I said it could, and it could also lead to the end of civilization if we lose control over the machines that we create. But the basic idea of why we want to create AI is that we've used our intelligence to make the civilization that we have. Roughly speaking, if we had more intelligence, we could make it better.
But is that, sorry, but Stuart, the reason I ask that is, and by the way, I've done a really lousy job of introducing you. This is Professor Stuart Russell. He wrote the book on artificial intelligence, which people like me say is the book, but then haven't read because it's a guidebook for people who actually can do the kind of coding and thinking about machines that I have to confess I'm not capable of, Stuart. But also books that people like me do and can read and recommend, like Human Compatible, that help us think about the relationship between machines and AI. And although we can't tell it from that lovely seaside scene, I don't know whether you're in Berkeley, but you're based in Berkeley. So
I am in Berkeley. Yep.
You're back. Okay. But Stuart, so can we just pursue it? The reason, there were a couple of moments in the first lecture, and for those people who haven't listened to the Reith lecture, you really should, not least because it's a joy. Right? Stuart makes the obvious comparison to himself, played by Johnny Depp in a movie, and that's, there are a fair few moments you're going to enjoy, but most of all, it makes the problem very, very real, but it also does this thing that tantalizes you with the prospects for what could be better as a result of well-defined, well-built AI. And so my hang on a minute question one, if you like, Stuart, is one of the things you say too is that let's not beat around the bush. General purpose AI has always been the purpose of people who work in your field. Why is that the case?
I think we have always understood intelligence in part, not just for its ability to solve particular tasks like playing chess or playing Go, but for its ability to solve more or less any task. The humans are not born as chess programs, obviously, and so we learn to do that, and we learn to do many other things, to cook spaghetti bolognese, to windsurf, to do literally millions of things. And so that generality is something that AI has always wanted to emulate. And it actually ends up giving you a much cleaner mathematical framework for what it is you would like your AI systems to, what properties you would like your AI systems to have, because it doesn't require that the human in advance decide what it is they want the intelligent system to do. So it's, and the reason why general purpose AI would be so different from what we have now. So maybe a simple example, right? So we think about search engines as being incredibly useful to us. And their market cap is in the trillions, and many people really couldn't function without them these days. But they took thousands or possibly even millions of person years to build. They required lots of analytical, mathematical work, lots of engineering, and so on and so forth. And then we created this artifact, and then we can use it as a search engine. But with general purpose AI, you wouldn't need to do any of that. You would simply ask the questions that you want to know the answers to, and the general purpose AI would figure out how to extract all that information from the internet and synthesize it and give you a good answer to the question. So you bypass decades of work and billions of dollars of design and construction effort for everything. You know, if you want a hospital, you just say, we need a hospital in our village. We don't have one. We'd like one. And the AI system designs it. The robots come along and build it. And you're done.
The only reason why, so the reason why I want to, and Helen, welcome. I'm trying to get Stuart, and then I'm going to try and get you to help us at the end of this, our AI Summit today, to try and map out the positive prospect for AI, the one that is socially beneficial. And I'll come to you in a moment, Helen, but I'm just trying to pursue through kind of 3 points in Stuart's Wreath lecture that left me sort of thinking, really. The first, Stuart, was this point about a link between intelligence and civilization. The second was the presumption that the AI community is seeking to build general purpose AI. And then you have this devastating line, and I'm sure I'm going to get it wrong, but what I think I heard was you say something along the lines of, no one has yet figured out a way to create, prevent, or detect consciousness. I think either in machines or in actual people. Is that right? You do say something along those lines, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So my question then is, how do you have any confidence that the relationship between that functional intelligence and the civilization that you say could be built by increased intelligence is possible without the link of consciousness, without an idea of what you're serving for?
So when we build any artifact, right, we do our best to understand its properties mathematically. So when you build a bridge, you do all the calculations to make sure it's going to hold the weight of a big lorry and so on. And when we build a sorting algorithm, we do an analysis of the code to make sure that it will in fact sort the numbers that you give it. And when we build an AI system, we do an analysis of the code to make sure that it does in fact learn to recognize speech correctly if you give it enough data. And so, you know, we're still in the early stages of being able to analyze the more and more complex systems that we're building. But that analysis does not anywhere in it have a magic box saying, and as long as the machine is conscious, then it will do this, right? There's just an analysis of the code.
Mm.
And so ideally, you would have confidence that the code will do what it's supposed to do without any reference to whether or not it's conscious. And even if you were told, if some oracle comes along and says, oh, by the way, it is conscious, right? It wouldn't change anything about your predictions of its behavior.
So then, Stuart, what is the answer to the question you posed at the end of the first lecture, the provably beneficial AI? What's the recipe for that?
Well, I don't know how much I want to give away because that's the fourth lecture, which will be broadcast on the 22nd of December. But it's in the book, so I suppose it's already out there. So the idea is that in contrast to the current way that we do AI, which is we build machines into which we plug a specific fixed objective that the machine optimizes, right? That's the failure mode that we need to get away from. Instead, we build machines that know that they don't know what future human beings want. But that is what the machine is sort of constitutionally obliged to pursue, is the future that human beings want. And that it almost sounds like I've set up an impossible problem. How can it pursue a goal that it doesn't know? But the simple answer is just as we do with each other, like when you go into a restaurant, the chef doesn't know what you want for dinner. And so what do we do? What's the solution? A menu, right? And you choose off the menu. This is what the chef can do. And then you say, this is what I would like. And maybe you negotiate. I'd like to substitute I'd like chips instead of mashed potato or whatever. And then eventually you settle on something. And so it's a little bit like that, except obviously it's much, much more complicated when we're talking about the whole future of the human race. But information flows from humans, us, to machines at runtime, as we say in computer science, right? While the algorithm is running, while the AI system is working out how to help us, information is flowing basically from our behavior, from all the choices that human beings make, including the choices to do nothing. So I assume that almost everyone in this discussion is actually listening to the discussion. That's a choice that you've made, not to read your email and not to be tweeting to your friends and so on. And all of that data is evidence about what humans want the future to be like. And so evidence is constantly flowing from the human race, or will be, from the human race to machines about what we want the future to be like. And that enables the machines to be more and more helpful. But at any given point, they're still going to have enormous amounts of uncertainty about how we want the future to unfold. And that actually means that they must be cautious in their behavior because they constitutionally don't want to violate the preferences that we have. But if they don't know what they are, then they have to be cautious. They have to ask permission before taking steps that change things in the world whose value is unknown to them. And so an example I give in the fourth lecture, I think, is that you might, the machines may come up with a solution for restoring carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, but it will change the oceans into sulfuric acid. And if it doesn't know our preferences about the oceans, then it will have an incentive to ask permission before carrying out the solution. And we would say, actually, no, we don't want the oceans to be made of sulfuric acid. So, so in a nutshell, that's how it works. And I could give a simple example that probably most people in the audience are familiar with, which is buying a birthday present for your partner. So
all help here, much appreciated.
Right. So your payoff in this process is how happy your partner is going to be with the present, right? But you don't know the answer to that, and the last 3 years running, you've got it completely wrong. And just to sort of to factor out the money part will allow you to buy it from the joint account. So it's really, a pure problem of how do I make my partner happy, and that's this position that the robot is going to be in with respect to the human race. And your partner may want to drop a hint. You may want to, secretly check with, your partner's friends, do you think they want this or that? And try to get more clues about it. So that's sort of the situation, if that helps.
I think it nearly helps, Stuart. All I should say in this particularly extended metaphor is that I wish the robot all the best of luck, because
yes.
not I should just say, because in my case, a particular fussiness, the opposite. The thing that's actually really lovely about my partner is that whatever you give her, she says it's wonderful, and then it takes about 3 years to find out whether she really likes it, whether it ever gets used or not. So this might be a challenge for the robot too. I'm going to bring in a moment David Wood, who's sort of touched this point on the consciousness question. I'll come back to that, David. Thanks for joining us. And I should have said at the beginning, of course, this is a Think In, it's Tortoise. We want to make sure we hear from different people with points of view and thoughts too. But Helen, thank you for your patience. I've got 2 questions. One is it a hard G or a soft G?
Hard G.
So welcome to Helen Margetts. It's very, very good to have you here. The rest of it I can do, Helen, is I think the title is one of the coolest I've heard. Professor of Society and the Internet at Oxford, and also a Turing Fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. And the second question is possibly a little harder, which is, I think you get billed in this world as someone who can help us think, how do you take the power of AI and improve public policy, improve government outcomes? And someone like me, who's lived a life as a journalist, actually having quite a good time just weighing in on the, wastes and failures of government computer programs, let alone AI, meets that with a certain degree of mischief and skepticism. So can you point us to where you're seeing those kinds of applications already having an impact?
Totally. And I should point out at the beginning that one of the reasons for my optimism is precisely what you just mentioned. I mean, if you think of a traditional government organization, it has no tradition of using data, because in a traditional Weberian bureaucracy, all the information is held in the files and it's not usable in any sense for analysis. There's no tradition of using transactional data to sort of make decisions. And that means, there really is a kind of incredible amount of scope for the narrow AI to distinguish it from general AI in terms of kind of satisfying limited objectives. And I guess the best example is health, of course, where AI is already provably beneficial in terms of diagnosing certain sorts of cancer and diagnosing heart failure, is being kind of built into clinical decision support systems with the hope that kind of all doctors will get some kind of AI powered insight from the moment that they first see a patient. There's all sorts of other possibilities, like, we're already seeing some kind of personalized, or at least very, very targeted drug development and development of medicines. There's the possibility of healthcare assistance in a place where there are crippling staff shortages. So there's also questions of resource allocation, which can be done much more efficiently with AI. So there's all sorts of examples in health, but in government more generally, I guess there's certain tasks that government has traditionally been bad at. One of them is measurement, for example. Governments are not very good at measuring things. So, for example, we still measure inflation in the UK by visiting 144 stores, I think it is, physical stores. And that is a really, really bad way to measure inflation, particularly during a pandemic. So there's all sorts of possibilities if government were able to measure things and kind of calibrate policy interventions. Another thing is, oh, sorry.
No, go on, Helen, sorry.
Well, another thing is simulation. If you can kind of simulate, if you can use data and modeling, data science, AI loosely defined, then you can actually simulate policy interventions, for example, I don't know, closing schools or something like that, without having to suffer the unintended consequences of doing something without evidence.
And Helen, there's a One of the simulation bit was the thing I was interested to ask you about, because there's a good and dark joke in Stuart's lecture early on about the language processing. And he tells us all, oh, you know, I still have to pay a certain number of taxes in French, so I can get the French tax code translated from impenetrable French into impenetrable English. And it made me laugh, because I just thought, yes, that's brilliant. You can do the language, but you can't fix the system. Are there signs that you're seeing of the use of AI, not kind of data processing at a mass scale, but AI in effect learning on public policy, where you're seeing experimentation, simulation that results in something that frankly humans sitting around a table with a bunch of papers wouldn't or haven't come up with?
Well, I'd like to think so, yes, because the kind of models that we're trying to build at the Turing, for example, are the kind of models that would bring together very different large-scale sources of data. So if you think during the pandemic again, it was lots of modeling, and suddenly it was cool to be a data scientist, and that was all great. But it was all very kind of siloed modeling. So it was a modeling of the health effects of something, or the modeling of the economics effect of something, but never putting them together. And actually putting together large-scale sources of data to get insight for them is something that humans are really rubbish at. And so there's real hope there that AI systems might enable us to do that kind of modeling, where you can have an intervention, you can think about what the effects would be on the health and the economy at the same time, instead of doing it in a siloed way. So that's just an example of where I think there's a lot of possibilities for the future.
Stuart, before I'm going to bring in David Wood, and if I might, I'd like to also bring in Peter Scott. But do you have any thoughts? Do you see any, with your eye to, if you like, a robot that serves the needs of a human, or, you know, comes up with that menu? Are you seeing yet, or are you seeing people designing yet that kind of AI that's a public policy or government menu?
Only a little. I mean, there have been successful applications of AI within government. It hasn't all been ghastly cost overruns and redos and disasters. I think, in fact, in Britain, eligibility for social security benefits has been handled by an expert system, I think, since the early 90s. And I think it's so straightforward and reliable, we probably don't even think of it as AI anymore.
But your point is, it's still a long way from being part and parcel of government of countries.
Yes, absolutely. We are nowhere near. I mean, I think there are some cities starting to do this with modeling of their infrastructure, transportation, water, power, and sanitation, and so on. So I think that might be a place where we'll start to see these kinds of integrated models. But it's a very difficult thing to do, because if you just model, the public transit, the water, the electricity, and so on, how do you deal with the people, right? It's no good modeling a city of the dead. You have to actually take into account the fact that there are millions of people in your city, and they're much harder to model than the buses and the trains and the electricity and the water. And understanding, in addition to modeling them, there's also a question: what are you trying to achieve? What is the objective? What does it mean to optimize the running of your city? And I think this has turned out to be very hard, even for the self-driving car, right?
Yeah.
What's the objective? It's all very well saying, oh, it's going to take me to the airport, and that's the objective, but that's only a tiny part of the objective, right? How do you trade off speed and safety, right? If you prioritize safety, that means you just stay in the garage. You never go out at all because it's not safe. And so you have to make trade-offs, and how do you make those trade-offs? And we don't have answers to those questions.
Stuart, can I just bring in Peter Scott? Because while you were talking, I don't know whether you saw, he asked this question about the short term versus long term. Peter, why don't you put the thought to Stuart and Helen?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Good. Hi, Stuart. I wanted to ask you, as being a very public figure, both computer scientist, AI textbook author, and you go out, you put yourself out there as this kind of lightning rod on the existential threat, talking about things like the robot cooking the family cat. And we have an idea of what sort of timescale you're looking at and why you're doing that, but the public attention span is so short. What sort of perils do you face in trying to get that narrative across the way you want it to and be understood in the sort of public spheres that you are inhabiting with that type of conversation the way that you would like?
That's a great question. And I think maybe an example would help. So recently I've been, partly because there are upcoming negotiations in Geneva, I've been talking about autonomous weapons. That's also the subject of the next Reef lecture, which will come out on Wednesday. And for some reason, the Financial Times interview with me says that I warned the MOD that AI weapons could wipe out humanity, which is not what I said. So in the FT article, it doesn't put that in quotes. But then the Times published an article where they put that in quotes, right? Computer scientists predicts AI, quote, AI weapons will wipe out humanity, which I didn't say at all, but they're quoting the FT article, which doesn't quote me. And actually, that's not really the point at all, right? The issue about autonomous weapons is completely separate from the existential threat of super intelligent AI. It's much more to do with humans using many, many millions of autonomous weapons as weapons of mass destruction to wipe out cities and so on, but not to wipe out humanity. That's not the issue. So it's this game of Chinese whispers. And then there's a letter in response to the FT article saying, oh, Professor Russell obviously doesn't know that Terminator is science fiction. But if you listen to the lecture or any of my many speeches and articles on this subject, I constantly warned against using the Terminator robot as your image of autonomous weapons because, well, for many things, one is it doesn't make sense that the Terminator robots fire lots of bullets that miss their targets, right? I mean, that's sort of a very misleading thing that couldn't really happen, right? It wouldn't make any sense. But the reason the Terminator robots are trying to kill us is because they're conscious, or rather Skynet is conscious, and it's, it has all the Terminators as puppets. And Skynet has decided that it hates us. And so it makes people think that the risk from killer robots is they might become conscious and turn against us, which is obviously complete nonsense. But weirdly, that is in fact the German government's official position. They say explicitly that a weapon is only autonomous if it is fully self-aware. So you get this sort of strange distortions that happen in this game of Chinese whispers in the public sphere. You have to just keep repeating the message. That's the reason why we made the Slaughterbots movie, was to try to get people in the public sphere, the policymakers, to see what it was that we were talking about, because clearly they weren't getting the message from PowerPoint and op-ed pieces and so on. So it's been eye-opening, and I'm certainly far from skilled at maneuvering in this unfamiliar space that I'm in.
Is it just on that point, on the German point, Stuart? And sorry, I'm going to hand over to David and to Maria in a second. But just on that German point, I don't know whether you were with us in the conversation we had a few months back with Demis Hassabis when he was there, and he made this interesting point on equivalent of a kind of global council for AI, i.e., some people who had some capacity both to understand the development and some supervisory authority. And I either worry about, in effect, democracy, and this is an extension of your point, Peter, democracy being incapable of thoughtfully curating and cultivating AI. And I don't know whether you have, and maybe this comes up in the lectures, that you've got an idea of how we govern this.
Well, simply put, no, I don't. And I think Demis is expressing something that a lot of us feel. For example, in cybersecurity, right? We look at this gigantic mess that's happening, right? So, for example, cybercrime is now as big as the entire software industry and the entire semiconductor industry combined. Right? So, I mean, you think, wow, it's not even clear that we're making a net positive contribution to the world if, in that case. So, so you always think, well, I don't know exactly how to solve this, but somewhere there's a room of grown-ups who do, and eventually they're going to get around to taking care of it. And I think what I'm learning is there is no room with grown-ups. Right? There are just many rooms with people who feel, you know, either they have the technical knowledge or they're policymakers who are advised by people who don't have any technical knowledge and so on. And I think the same is happening in autonomous weapons. You know, I've asked British government officials about some contradictions in their policy on autonomous weapons, and the response was, well, when you put it that way, it does sound rather silly, doesn't it? You know, so I think Demis's proposal for a council is something that we might want to look at for many areas, cybercrime, climate, and so on. But those things haven't yet emerged because we don't have a process. And you could obviously see some drawbacks, right? You know, definitely. The philosopher kings, you know, they'd have to have power, but where would the accountability come from?
I want to loop back in a minute on social media as an example of this problem, because you both said things about this. But Helen, I couldn't tell whether, as Stuart was despairing of the lack of a room of grown-ups, in fact, we've got neither the room nor the grown-ups, whether you think there's a place that they might be hiding.
Well, there's always humans in the loop. There's always humans in the, if you look at AI in the world as a kind of socio-technical system, there's humans developing it, there's humans using it, and of course, as Stuart pointed out, humans make the process more difficult because they make it all more complicated because humans are really messy. But the point is that you have got to build in controls right from the get-go into every aspect of the development, design, and use of AI, control over those humans, particularly through regulation. I mean, AI is a kind of horizontal technology in that it gets into everything, into every market, into every aspect of society. And it's also vertical, that it has profound and distinct implications for different sectors. So there are implications here for every sort of regulator. And I think we have got to get much better at regulating, because one of the things that AI does is it makes clear things so that we're all, sort of reinforces things so that we're always true. So like military decision making has always been really opaque. The use of technology has always been really opaque, and with little accountability, you know, black holes in budgets and so on. So yeah, I mean, there is hope here in that some of the problems that we have to tackle when we use AI, bias, for example, you know, humans are pretty biased, and a lot of bias in AI systems comes from humans. So at least we are sort of thinking about those things, perhaps for the first time in some cases. I mean, in my team at the Turing, for example, where we think about AI and government, we've really got ethicists at the table thinking about how to develop these systems. And they weren't there before. Do you see what I mean? It makes these ethical questions quite explicit in ways that they weren't explicit before. And that's kind of an opportunity. We might get more ethical than we used to be if we have to consider these questions.
I think you're right. And just to point out, Jan Hall, who was there in that conversation with Dennis, makes the point that he was thinking, I think, Stuart and Helen, of an institute or a council where people are doing the research so that they are understanding the AI developments, but also then, if you like, codes of conduct. I see kind of codes and controls was the phrase that Jan uses, which I think is right. I've held Maria back for a second. Maria, you're probably doing a better job than I am of trying to keep us on the topic of good uses of AI, keeping close to kind of Stuart's provably beneficial. You touched on pollution.
Yes. Like,
oh, Maria, your line is not brilliant. Let's have another go. Do you want to try with your camera off, see whether that's any better? No, I'm afraid you're frozen. You're lost.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Yes, I can. Have another go.
Okay. The only question my only.
Oh, Maria, I'm sorry. Will you write it in the chat and then I'll kind of I'll play it in. David Wood.
But this is a really fascinating discussion. There's so many angles that deserve digging deeper into. I wonder if I can go back to the question of machine consciousness, which James introduced right at the beginning, when he said that we have little understanding of what machine consciousness might be. Now, I entirely agree that machines don't need to be conscious to be dangerous. You're entirely right, Stuart, surely, that the cruise missiles, landmines, and all kinds of other weapons and all kinds of social media can be very dangerous without having internal consciousness. But my question is, can we actually have a full discussion of beneficial AI and exclude the question of whether machines could be conscious? Or is it something that's just too far outside our capability to think about? I do think, by the way, that Anil Seth, in his recent book, Being You, makes some progress towards understanding what machine consciousness would be like. So I don't think it's a complete dead end. But I wonder if you think we should set that discussion aside and focus on beneficial AI rather than conscious AI.
Well, I think it would be hard to focus on conscious AI because I mean, I've not read Anil Seth's book, but I think I'm not aware of any constructive suggestion for what type of research one could do, either on how you detect consciousness in AI or how you create it or how you prevent it. And so I jokingly often say, if you gave me $1 trillion to work on conscious AI, I would just give it back because I literally would not know what to do at all. I could not advise a student on a research project. I couldn't type anything useful about it. I couldn't write any code that would have any relevance to it. And I think that's true for every AI researcher. The question about consciousness that does deserve thought is, if it were the case that, unbeknownst to us, our AI systems were conscious and were having subjective experience of positive or negative valence, then we would presumably, as we do for ourselves and for other animals, want to take that into account in our decision making, and in some sense, they accord them rights. As were just extended to lobsters, I understand, in the UK, yes. Which is an interesting development. So that's a significant question. And if it were true, it would cause all sorts of problems, right? We would, would they have democratic rights? And, what if someone makes 1 billion copies of a given program? Do they all get a vote? And, and so on and so forth, right? So are you allowed to turn off your laptop at the end of the day? It gets quite complicated very quickly. But if you just ask one simple question, right? What is the probability that that's true, right? That in fact, perhaps not my laptop, but some future laptop that's running more sophisticated AI, what is the probability that it is in fact conscious? I don't even know how you'd begin to answer that question. So I couldn't see how you could put any number on the on that probability.
Stuart, thank you. I think this also might be the first time that I've ever heard a researcher say, if you gave me $100 million to research a subject, I'd give the money back. So I think that's also an important moment in the relationship between academia and public funding. But I wanted to ask you, and I wanted to ask you and Helen actually, two questions about the here and now, in the last 10 minutes we've got. One is actually that relationship between public and private. You say something, Stuart, at the end of this first lecture, and I know it's recorded a bit ago, so you may not actually remember what the Q&A was, but one of the points was, you answered by saying, look, I'm actually quite encouraged by the exchange of research in the private sector around AI. I'm more worried about coordination between government. And I've just come fresh from reading this really brilliant piece of reporting on Pfizer and its handling of the COVID vaccine and the FT. And I was like, you know what, I'm really suspicious of that. I'm suspicious of having confidence in the private sector and big private companies sharing of AI research and innovation. What made you say that? What gives you confidence that's happening?
I think the pharmaceutical industry and the computer science industry, if we call it that, I don't like the word tech very much. They just have very different ways of doing things. It's absolutely normal in the pharmaceutical industry that the research you're doing, if you discover a molecule that has high potential, you wouldn't want to publish that until everything is nailed, all the IP is nailed down, and so on. And even in academia, working in these areas in biology, it's quite common for labs not to share their data. If they generate a data set, they want to milk as much as they can, papers in Nature and Cell and so on, possibly Nobel Prizes, before sharing anything. And I've heard that some labs even send visitors to other labs basically to spy on them, in case they're getting ahead in the race to find some discovery. Whereas what seems to be happening in industry in the computer science area is that companies want to get access to the best talent. They can't get the best talent if they don't allow them to publish openly and to collaborate with their peers in other companies, in other countries. So it's very common to see papers with authors from, DeepMind and some Chinese university.
Working together.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. All right, then let me in the last few minutes we've got, tuck in on a subject which is sort of closer to my heart and life, and one that feels, I think, accessible to all of us, which is a subject I think, Helen, you and Stuart have both done some research and thinking on, which is social media and the governance of those algorithms and their impacts. And Helen, I wonder whether you'd go first, because I've read some of the things that you've written, and if anything, the arguments, or one of the things that you said in the things that you've written, is the argument of how the social media has enabled political participation, has actually got the capacity to be good for our democratic system. So how did you react to the things that Stuart said recently about social media, dictatorship, Chernobyl, etc.?
Yeah, well, I do have a different perspective, because I'm a political scientist. I sort of believe in democracy and how it can be better. And I think we shouldn't throw away. I think there is a danger in kind of focusing on the dangers and the risks of throwing away some of the good things that social media, for example, have afforded us. And one of the things that they've allowed is these kind of tiny acts of political participation. They've lowered the entry cost to politics and democracy, which used to be much more the province of the sort of activist elite. And they do allow, I mean, there can be no country in the world that hasn't seen wide-scale mobilization on one or other issue. And they have widened the possibility that somebody with no more resources than a mobile phone can play a part in fighting injustice. Very small part, and possibly it won't make any difference because these tiny acts, you know, sometimes they scale up to something important like US school children protesting for gun controls or something like that, or huge environmental activism. Mostly they don't, but there is that possibility there, that sort of democratization of democracy, if you like, which I think we need to protect. And I do think the key to that is regulation, that we have to regulate social media companies, and we have to find ways to collaborate with them as well. I mean, if I had this $1 trillion that Stuart's not going to take,
100 million. It's 100 million, Helen. Don't shortchange.
Well, I did say $1 trillion, actually.
You said
$1 trillion. Oh, I see.
That might be what I need. It would be kind of tooling up public institutions, democratic institutions, regulators, you know, to kind of be able to oversee and in some sense control the size, control social media companies the size of the countries.
But Helen, forgive me, I'm very, very persuaded by Stuart's, I'm sure it's more sophisticated than this, but general counsel of despair on social media, its impact on what's happening with our minds, because, and it makes me even more worried about AI, because this is, if you like, playing at home for politicians. This is in the realm they understand. It's media, it's words, it's ideas, it's the movement of public opinion. And even then, our politicians have been so late to try and deal with this. And when they have done it, it's been ineffectual and small.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's urgent. That's why there's no time to hang around. I think if you think of the various regulators that are responsible for electoral regulation in this country, for example, you know, they're all very ill-equipped to deal with it. And I think they need help, they need research, they need some of that $1 trillion. It's not surprising when you think how quickly this has happened.
Yeah.
You know, democracy and government have been around for a while.
Yeah.
Social media being completely embedded in our social, political, and economic lives has happened in about 15 years. So it's not surprising. I'm not letting them off the hook at all, but I think there is a need for kind of help in tooling up to deal with this.
Stuart, will you give us your diagnosis of social media and the oversight of it, and what we should draw from that about future oversight of AI?
So I think what's happening, and I basically completely agree with everything Helen just said. I think there is huge upside potential, but as my late colleague Robert Walensky said, you know, it used to be said that if you got enough monkeys on enough typewriters, one of them would write Shakespeare, and the internet has proved that wrong. So the hypothesis that many researchers have is basically that, okay, the algorithms are deciding, you know, what's in your news feed, what's the next video that you watch, and so on. And those algorithms are trying to maximize an objective. And they use machine learning to do that. And the objective is typically the probability that you click on the next video, or how long you spend engaged with the platform, how much interaction you have with the content by liking it or sharing it, and so on. So they use all these metrics. But as we've known for thousands of years, right? If you optimize the wrong metric, it can be disastrous. And it's pretty clear that these are the wrong metrics. Hypothetically, what the algorithm is going to do, in fact, well, this is not hypothetical, this is a mathematical fact, that what the algorithm is going to do is to send sequences of content to change you into the most predictable version of yourself that it can produce within a manageable horizon. So if perhaps you're a member of the Green Party, if it has a way to turn you into an eco-terrorist who will consume ravenously content about the evils of the oil companies or whatever else it might be, then it will do that. Not because it has a political viewpoint, it doesn't even know that human beings exist, right? It's just an algorithm that's trying to maximize the long-term sum of clicks. And that's how it's going to behave. The problem is we don't have access to the data or the algorithms to find out, is this really happening? And could we do it differently? But there is now a very active community trying to figure out how to make provably beneficial recommender systems, so that when we use social media, it has all the good effects that Helen talked about, that we would be more informed, we'd be more curious, our political instincts would be awakened, we would want to get involved and active. But instead, our animal instincts are being awakened, it seems, and we're being polarized. And there was an interesting article last week in the Washington Post about what's happened in Chile, which used to be, South America's model of centrist, sensible government. And now, it's an election contest between, Pinochet, Pinochet disciple, so an extreme, violent right-winger, and a fairly extreme left-winger. And there's a government minister who was quoted as saying he doesn't understand how in just 2 years his country could have become so dramatically polarized. But when you have algorithms that are nudging people 500 times a day in a customized way, I'm each algorithm, right? There's a copy of the algorithm just for you, James, and it's learned how your mind works and how to manipulate you in the most successful way. And it's doing it hundreds of times a day, pushing you in some direction. It's not at all surprising that in 2 years you can see this kind of change.
Well, it has me, whatever it's doing, this algorithm, it's got me on a hamster wheel of pointless optimism by the sounds of things. I keep on getting close to a thought that says, actually, there's a good outcome, and then rather being dashed. Sorry, Helen, you wanted to just come back on Stuart's point?
Yeah, I do. Of course, I understand what Stuart's saying, but I do think we've got in a place where we sort of blame social media for everything. They do shape our decisions, but they don't determine them. And there's a lot going on in the online world. There's influences. The average teenager belongs to at least 5 platforms. 2 of which you've heard of and 3 of which you haven't. So it is a lot more complicated, I think, than just being determined, and that does give more hope in terms of what might be done about it to control the kind of influences that Stuart's talking about. But totally agree about the point. I mean, there's this terrible information data asymmetry between anyone who tries to control this and researchers and the research world doing the kind of research Stuart was talking about, and the companies themselves, because the algorithms are proprietary, the data is very tightly guarded, and even the regulators don't have it, and I think we should try and do something about that.
Can I just briefly mention, sorry, I just want to mention, so coming back to Demas's point about, some global council, there is the Global Partnership on AI, which is, I think, how 25 nation states are members of that. Mm-hmm. So it's a real international organization. It's not just a collection, a talking shop with scientists complaining about where, there not being any grown-ups. This is a place where ministers from all the major economies are talking to experts. And one of the things that's happening there is that New Zealand is negotiating an agreement with Twitter to actually get some kind of research access to the internals of Twitter, so they can understand how to avoid what happened in Christchurch with the massacre that seems to have resulted from online radicalization. So there are beginnings of opening in the industry. I'm sorry?
Sorry, Stuart, are they getting that access? Twitter said yes.
Yes, I think that's the case.
Interesting. Yeah. Stuart, can I just ask you one final thing? And I promise it's the final thing, so I realize we've run over time by a couple of minutes. I just want to go back to where we started at the beginning of the day, and you weren't with us, but Alexandra sort of set out the latest findings, that kind of she and Luke Bedimer and Kim Dower and Patricia Clark have kind of been sitting in a windowless room for a fair few weeks now, trying to work out what the Global AI Index says, and being very parochial about it. What it says is not brilliant for the UK, i.e. the UK likes to kind of toot its horn for being kind of number 3 in the global race. That position feels, if anything, more and more precarious. And I just wondered, just a final thought, what would your prescription be for the UK to kind of secure its place there?
That's a good question, and I've been trying to answer that, I think, since I was chairman of British Scientists Abroad in the late 80s, and people were asking, how can Britain, maintain its position in science? And there's no single answer. I think what the Turing Institute is doing in terms of trying to train large numbers of people, but keeping them in the UK is often the problem, right? Because the giant US companies see it as, happy hunting grounds for PhDs who might be willing to work for less than $1 million a year. Which is sort of where we are in Silicon Valley right now. So I actually, I'm not a believer in Kai-Fu Lee's analysis of the current situation vis-a-vis China and the US, where he basically is arguing that AI is already here, and what matters is your ability to turn it into products and services. I don't believe AI is already here. And the future, if it doesn't belong to the whole world, which I think it should, the future will belong to those who are able to make the breakthroughs that will produce general purpose AI. And there, I think, as long as Britain maintains the vitality of its universities, and I think strong links to companies like DeepMind, which are really at the cutting edge, then I think there's every chance that the UK will stay in the race. I see that that sort of Oxford, Cambridge, UCL, Imperial, DeepMind complex actually is being very prominent in the field, and a huge asset for Britain.
Okay, well, Stuart, thank you.
Let me say one more thing, right? And yes, make the Turing Institute into a real institute with real high quality permanent research, just like the laboratory for molecular biology is, or the CRIC, for example.
Oh, you mean just in terms of endowment?
Endowment and its sort of whole personnel structure, right? It's
well, that's good. Well, those are two, the A, practical, and B, positive. So I couldn't thank you enough for that. So it's a perfect way to end. Helen and Stuart, firstly, a big thank you to you both. You're often looking as a journalist for the simplest question, and I found myself kept on writing down, Stuart, provably beneficial. Is it provably beneficial? It feels like a much better question than the question that most of us journalists generally ask. So I'll think about that as we continue to think about AI, but a great deal of other things too. One of the things that's been great about today for us is thinking about AI in the context that getting broader and, if you like, more immediate. So not just this conversation between the two of you about social media, but the conversation we had earlier, particularly around climate and around data, much more around accountability. It's been a really fascinating day. I just wanted to say 2 words of thanks at the end. One is to Kainos, who makes it possible by being a supporter of this AI summit for us to get together and think with you, the great people here, but also particularly to my colleagues, Alexi Mostras, and to Tabitha Goldstyle, and to Alexandra Musavizadeh, and as I said, to Luke, Patricia, and Kim, who've really put their heads together and made it a thing worth thinking about, our Global AI Index. So a big thank you to everyone. You're getting lots and lots of people in the chat saying, thanks very much, it was great. It certainly felt great to me. Thank you very much for everyone's time. And we can't give you a round of applause, Helen or Stuart, but we can give you a sort of cheerful wave. Thank you very much.